What's up guys, thanks for checking out another one of our videos. I hope you've seen the predecessor to this video. It's where I talk about stock fuel limitations on the Focus ST and the turbos that fit within that limit. This video is going to go beyond the stock fuel limitations. So as you can see, there is no stock fuel limitation. We can go up to whatever we want to, and that depends on what turbo you choose, what kind of power you want to make with your Focus ST. To start, let's talk about some fuel system upgrades, because in order to get beyond the factory fuel limitations, you have to be able to get more fuel in the engine in order to work with these different turbos. The most prevalent upgrade for the factory fuel system is what we call aux fuel or auxiliary fuel. It's where we add an extra 2 injectors and a throttle body spacer, or an extra 4 injectors and a manifold spacer, and we run those off of a secondary fuel controller called the split second controller. This taps into your coil packs, your coil pack harness, your map sensor, and it bases its control over the auxiliary injectors off of manifold pressure, like the voltage from the map sensor and the RPM from the coil packs. You can tell the auxiliary injectors to inject a certain amount more over what the stock can control. So if your stock fuel system limitation is about there, 370, 380 wheel horsepower, then you can then add enough fuel with aux fuel to get over that and make as much power as you want. We made 640 wheel horsepower on our shop Focus ST with 4 injectors and a manifold spacer. There are no limitations with this setup except for your engine and your turbo. However, the system is a bit clunky and it's complicated. Having to control an extra ECU that has to work with the factory ECU and doesn't super well, and you're having to wire in extra electronics to your factory wiring harness. So there are areas or potential points of failure that you're adding into the system. It's similar to running water meth injection, though more reliable than water meth injection for sure, but it's still another system that could potentially stop working and then cost you a motor. The injector stops spraying, the controller loses its power or ground, or an injector loses its control signal and either oversprays or doesn't spray, and there goes a motor. While those things can happen with the factory injectors too, for sure, these are added complications that you're putting in on top of what could already go wrong. So you're compounding points of failure. I don't mean to scare you from doing it, because lots of people do it with great success, but it's just something to think about when you're looking to upgrade and make more than the factory fuel limit of about 380 horsepower. The other option, and this is much more recent, is a company called XDI makes an upgraded high pressure fuel pump and injectors. And with their pump and injectors, they say that you can make, I believe, 500 wheel horsepower, maybe 550 wheel horsepower on full E85 with just a pump and injectors. So if your power goal is 500 to 550 wheel horsepower, the upgraded high pressure fuel pump and injectors might be the better option for you, mainly because they are less complicated. They run off the factory ECU. You don't have a secondary system that has to be tuned or controlled or made to work with the factory ECU. You install them, you tune for them, and you run it. They just work. Granted, like anything else, there are points of failure, but with these, there are less points of failure. They've been well tested and well vetted and have proven to make gains. The downside to these is that they are quite a bit more expensive than an aux fuel setup. While it is a cleaner, easier install and much easier to tune from the tuner's perspective, it is more expensive for the end user. And that might be a detriment to some of you who are trying to make this kind of power on a budget. But whichever way you go, you are getting past the factory limitations. You are making way more power than what you previously could. And because of that, you need to be able to choose a turbo that's going to work well with your newfound fuel capabilities. So back to the bottom, the GTX 2867 and or the EFR 6758. Like I said in the previous video, your peak torque is going to happen in this 4,000 RPM range for the GTX 2867. We're going to call it an E50 blend because most people on aux fuel or if you're upgrading the high pressure fuel pump only, you're not going to really want to run more than E50. Though with 4-port aux fuel, you can run fully 85 if you have an upgraded in-tank fuel pump, which is another step in the fuel limitation game, because the Focus ST fuel pump is very difficult to upgrade. It's recommended that you go with something like a surge tank, where the factory pump lifts fuel to the surge tank. The surge tank has the upgraded pump, which supplies fuel to both the direct injection and port injection systems. The factory low pressure pump is generally good to about 500, maybe 550 wheel horsepower on the Focus ST. So is 2-port aux, by the way. I'm circling back to the fuel now, so sorry for the confusion, but I guess I should make it clear that if you're running a 2-port aux fuel setup, about 500 wheel horsepower is gonna be the most you wanna make out of that setup. If you're running a 4-port aux fuel setup, you can take it as high as you want. The XDI fuel pump alone is gonna be good to about 450 wheel horsepower on an ethanol blend like E50. The XDI pump and injectors is gonna be good to 500 to 550 wheel horsepower. But then again, once you hit that 500 to 550 wheel horsepower area, you're probably gonna wanna start looking at running a surge tank or upgrading the low pressure fuel pump. Back to the turbo. GTX 2867, EFR 6758. We're gonna see that peak torque in the 4,000 RPM range, and then our horsepower will match it. Assuming we're revving out to 7,000 RPM, we don't have a built head on this imaginary car. We are peaking torque a little bit later. We're making about 400 to 430 foot-pounds of torque, and about 440 horsepower is gonna be the limit of the 2867. So that's a substantial gain over the factory fuel system if you've chosen to go with a smaller, quicker spooling turbo like the 2867. Keep in mind, this is also cheaper than the G-Series turbos, or the 6758, which again is going to give you a little bit faster spool than the 2867, and very similar horsepower capabilities. With the EFR 6758, I've seen as much as 450. I think in one case I got like 460 out of one of those turbos, but that is going to be the limit for that turbo if you have the fuel capabilities to do so. I'm not going to advocate that you run this on a stock block, stock head setup. With the right tune, this kind of power could last on a stock block. I don't recommend it. It is very risky. If you intend to run this kind of power on a stock block, you should be ready to build a motor, because these kinds of things are not guaranteed. Any kind of tuning, any kind of bigger than stock turbo is going to potentially land you in an expensive failure if you're not careful. If any little thing goes wrong, you could have a failure. So when doing this kind of stuff, it's best to be prepared to be ready to put a built motor in. While you could have a setup last at this power level, it's definitely not something that I recommend for most people who aren't quite ready to build their motors. Next up, we've got the EFR 7163 and the GTX 3071. So again, EFR 7163, gonna be about 4,000 RPM, probably about 450 horsepower. So the EFR 7163, again, is gonna peak torque around 4,000 RPM, and you're gonna be able to make around 500 wheel horsepower on that turbo. Probably just short of 500 wheel horsepower realistically. And that also is gonna depend on your map sensors, because you are gonna start running out of boost capability at about upper 400s, which is to say about 28 to 29 PSI. And that is where the factory 3-bar map sensors flatten out. So you don't want to push to that limit. It's best to upgrade your map sensors if you want to go more, but the EFR 7163 and the GTX 3071 will do more power if you have the upgraded map sensors. You can probably get those to about 500 wheel horsepower. Now, the EFR 7163 and the GTX 3071, if you're getting the smaller hot side with the ATP GTX 3071, they will spool very similarly. They will make very similar power, but the ATP kits have a fairly well-known issue when it comes to trying to get past 500 wheel horsepower, and that's that the turbo elbow and the wastegate design are not super efficient. The wastegate is in the opposite direction of flow through the turbo elbow, and therefore when running an external wastegate setup, you introduce more turbulence and back pressure, and these things fight against you being able to make power. So that is why the ATP kits tend to peter out around 500 wheel horsepower. But for both the EFR 7163 and the GTX 3071 with the smaller hot side, you're gonna have a real nice power band, 3,000 RPM still, but all above 400 wheel horsepower. And that is gonna make for a very fast car, a very fast setup. All of these turbos work, that I've talked about so far, work very well below the factory fuel limitation, but they also have room to grow to get you to your higher goals should you upgrade the fuel system like we have here. Going bigger than this is where, with the ATP kits, is where you start to run into trouble. The ATP kits, again, are gonna be slower to spool when you start going bigger, and they're gonna be limited to around 500 wheel horsepower. So this very poorly dot graph is basically GTX 3076. It's gonna be spooling slower than these other two. You can make more torque and potentially more horsepower, but again, you're gonna be limited by the ATP kit. And that's why I recommend something like the CPE Atmosphere kit, because that kit will not be limited. Not only will you see faster spool, in fact, spool that will match the EFR 7163 on a GTX 3076, you will still be able to benefit from the higher power. So if you plan to go more than 500 wheel horsepower, you need to be looking somewhere else besides ATP. The ATP kits are gonna be good up to about 500, anything above that, and you should be looking at the Atmosphere kit or a Precision Turbo kit or a custom kit. So now we go back to the G Series turbos, which I think are my current favorite turbos for the platform. I think for the Focus ST, and really for most 4-cylinder cars in general, the 500 wheel horsepower mark is like the golden line. You can get to 500 wheel horsepower. Your car, even with a built motor, is going to be relatively reliable. You're not gonna be breaking things all the time. You start trying to pass that 500 wheel horsepower mark, you start trying to go for records, you are gonna deal with a high repair bill when transmissions break occasionally, when axles break occasionally, when random things take out your 640 horsepower motor like a spark plug. Those are issues that you start to introduce when you try to go past the 500 horsepower mark. Things just become less reliable, which is why the G Series turbos are my favorite. The G25 660 is gonna be capable of high 400 horsepower. With the smaller AR, you should be able to touch right around 500 wheel horsepower with the larger AR, and you're not gonna sacrifice all that much spool with the bigger AR. I base most of this off of my own personal experience. At higher altitudes, we aren't hurt by the smaller AR because we have like less back pressure to begin with. So we're able to benefit from the smaller AR and have the quicker spool, albeit still slower at higher elevation, and then not be hurt on the top end. So for you high altitude guys that are up here in Colorado with me, get the smaller AR if you have the option. But for you sea level guys, the bigger AR will give you more power at the cost of some spool uptime. With the G25 660, it's going to make the most of your power band in the limits of the factory fuel system and above the limits of the factory fuel system. That's why these turbos are so awesome. That's why so many people buy these turbos, but they are more expensive. But you do get your money's worth out of them. While you are limited to the 500 horsepower ceiling with the ATP kits, I'm really hoping that CPE will have some G Series options with their Atmosphere kit soon, because I would imagine we'll see some even faster spool and maybe even a little bit more power capabilities out of that turbo once there is a little bit more efficient turbo elbow and wastegate setup for that turbo. So that, ladies and gentlemen, should cover the turbo lineup for those of you that are going to be going bigger than the factory fuel system. I have not included anything about the stock turbo in this video because it can't touch the factory fuel system limits, and I've not included anything about hybrid turbos or smaller Garrett turbos in this video because they also can't touch the factory fuel system limits. It pretty much starts with the GTX 2867 or the EFR 6758 and goes up to the 3076 for those of you that are looking for bolt-on options. Though I don't recommend the 3076 in the ATP package, I do recommend the GTX 3071 with the smaller AR. I really like the EFR 7163 for this power range because it spools super fast for the size it is. I would put the 7163 in the same category as like a G Series 25660. I hope this clears up some questions for some of you guys who are wondering what turbo to install. There really aren't as many options as you think. While you can get nitty-gritty with all the different in-betweens, the main ones are really the ones you should be thinking of. And just because you want something that not everyone else has done doesn't mean that that's going to satisfy you on any other front other than the unique front. Because doing something that other people haven't done, oftentimes there's a reason why other people haven't done it. And sticking with tried and true will give you a better result. GTX 2867, EFR 6758. Up from that, EFR 7163, GTX 3071 with the small hot side. Kind of in that same realm, the G Series 25550 or 660. And that's gonna be your 500 horsepower turbo options, all of which are still good turbos if you're not gonna upgrade the fuel system. Therefore, they are excellent choices for those of you who are unsure. Anyways, I hope you liked this video. I hope you found it informational. If you do like it, hit that like button, ring the bell for notifications, and be sure and check out the other video where I talked about the stock fuel limitations and talked about these same turbos, but within the confines of the factory fuel limitations. Because if you do not intend to upgrade the fuel system, then you might want to know a little bit more about how these turbos perform below the factory fuel line. Thanks for liking and subscribing our videos, and we'll catch you next time.